Welcome to Public Square. This is Ditmir Bushati. My guest today is Nathalie Tocci. Nathalie is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionale, fellow and professor at various prestigious institutions in US and Europe. She has been special advisor to EU High Representatives Mogherini and Borrell, where she wrote the European Global Strategy and worked on its implementation. Nathalie is a frequent media commentator with regular op-eds and one of the most influential voices in Europe. Welcome to Public Square, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to have you on this program. 1 year after the war in Ukraine, what are your main takeaways in political, economic and security terms?
Well, firstly, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I think that indeed, when the war started, this was, like the pandemic, like the Eurozone crisis, like other crises that Europe has gone through, the perennial question facing the EU is the European Union going to live up to Jean Monnet's promise? And Jean Monnet's promise and prediction that Europe would be made out of the solutions of the crises that it would face. And so indeed, this was, probably the biggest crisis of all facing the European continent. And the question, really was, is Europe going to come out stronger or not as a result of this crisis? Any student or observer of Europe's role in the world would always be quick to point out to the number one sort of malady of the European Union, which is unity, or rather divisions. And so in a sense, the first question really is, has this war galvanized unity, or has it sowed political divisions in Europe? And of course, let's not forget the fact that Russia has traditionally been one of the most divisive and polarizing elements in European foreign policy. There has traditionally been, in a sense, a divide between East European member states pushing for a more assertive line towards Russia, West and South European member states pushing for greater engagement. So the question really was, would this war actually make those divisions grow, or would it actually have the reverse effect of unity? Now, the fact that when the war began, the effect was obviously unity and solidarity was in many respects not that surprising, in the sense that Russia's aggression was so extreme, it was so obscene that it would have been a little bit strange had this been a divisive, question in Europe. But I remember very well what the debate was like in the summer of 2022. And, and this was, sort of, 4 or 5 months into the war. And back then, many thought, hey, there's going to be a division between what was defined by the European Council on Foreign Relations, the peace and the justice camp, where by peace, obviously, rather than peace, what was really meant was compromise, and by justice, what was really meant was a just peace. And so there would be a division between West and South European members, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, pushing for compromise, and North and East European member states saying there can only be a just peace. And I think what is really quite remarkable is that here we are, sort of a year and a half later, and those divisions haven't actually materialized. I think the sanction story is really evidence of the fact that that unity is actually holding. So politically, I would say far better than our expectations, which then brings to the question, why is it that political unity has held? And I think probably the number one part of the answer is because we're not in an economic crisis. And we're not in an economic crisis because we have faced the energy crisis remarkably well. And this is perhaps the even more surprising sort of element of the story. Again, if we rewind back at the beginning of the war, I remember having conversations with, energy experts, sort of people in the energy sector. And, I would ask them, what's going to happen if Russia turns off the taps? And well, firstly, they said, well, this is never going to happen. I mean, it is so irrational for Russia to do this that it will just never be so mad as to do this. And I would say, well, let's, for the sake of argument, let's say it does do it. Well, what's going to happen? And the answer across the board was, this is going to be war economy. It's going to plunge Europe in the worst economic recession ever. There is no way we are going to replace around, on average, 40% of our gas dependence on Russia. And therefore, it is going to trigger an unspeakable economic recession. And that was what many feared would then bring those divisions politically to the fore. And that hasn't happened, right? We have gone from 40% to, under 6-7% of our dependence on Russian gas, which basically means we're not really dependent anymore. We have done so by coordinating our gas storage, moving forward towards joint procurement on gas, diversifying, of course, our energy sources with other countries, from Qatar to the United States, to Mozambique, to Angola, to Egypt, literally, across the board. And we have done all this, and this is perhaps the other very important part of the story, also by accelerating the energy transition. And so, sort of the trajectory of our investments in renewables since the war has actually seen a very remarkable uptick compared to what it would have otherwise been had the war not taken place. In security and defense terms, probably the picture, I would say, is not as clear-cut, though.
And how would you see the reaction of what we call global south, or countries which do not belong into the Western family of nations in relation to these crises and to all these challenges that you are mentioning also in the economic and energy sphere?
I think initially it kind of, Europeans were taken a little bit aback. And once you start scratching the surface of, votes in the UN General Assembly, where initially you say, great, only 32 countries abstained. But then you kind of look at what these countries, sort of how large these countries are and how much of the proportion of, the world basically they represent, that it really came as somewhat as a shock. Then I think we went through a phase of thinking about good arguments. How is it that we could persuade these countries? And, sort of some said, well, this is a story about democracy and autocracy. And then it was like, that argument's not gonna that is not gonna fly too much. Then, they would say, well, no, this is a point about international law. It's about sovereignty and territorial integrity. And yes, indeed, countries in the global south, in theory, should be responsive to this, but in kind of practice, they didn't really seem to be very responsive. The international law argument, had limited traction. Then there was the colonialism argument. This is a colonial war. Surely you countries in Africa and Asia should be, should really be sensitive to this argument. And that argument didn't really fly much, sort of either, largely because, of course, it was coming from European countries, which obviously have, quite a few skeletons in their own cupboard. So the point I'm trying to make here is that persuasion doesn't work. I think now we're in a more pragmatic moment of basically saying, okay, well, country X, what is it that you want? So in a sense, going very transactional about it. And, sort of, are you worried about food security? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about things that matter to you. And let's try and see whether actually there is something that we can give, and obviously we can take. in relation to your position in the war in Ukraine. Amongst these countries, it's important to make a distinction between those countries largely in Africa and Southeast Asia that basically just feel they don't have a dog in this fight. They are worried about the consequences of the war. They don't really care about the war itself. They consider it to be a European war out there. And they just basically want to keep out of it. And then I would say there are other countries that tend to be larger and more powerful. Countries like India or like Saudi Arabia, to an extent, Turkey as well, that, rather than wanting to keep out of this conflict, they want to, quote unquote, exploit advantages on both sides. So in many respects, it's how can I put it? A sad situation. It's sad to live in a world in which these norms don't actually have a lot of traction. In other respects, I think there's greater honesty to these relationships now. There is less finger wagging on the Western side, but also, in a sense, we've kind of, these countries have been called out. They don't really care about these norms either. So it's definitely sad, but perhaps more honest.
Let's focus on the argument that this is just a European war, and as you mentioned earlier, this can be a Jean Monnet moment for Europe to transform this huge crisis into an opportunity. And my direct question to you is Europe able to resist Russia in the eastern part of the continent without addressing the consequences of the war in Yugoslavia?
Well, exactly. So this brings us, I think, to the question of enlargement as a whole. And I'll put it to you in these terms. Beginning in the 1970s, really, with the Helsinki process in the 1970s, and of course, after the end of the Cold War, there was this assumption and this objective, really, to build a European security architecture with Russia. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, that enlargement didn't take place. Of course, it did take place. I mean, the EU enlargement to Eastern Europe, NATO enlargement, etc. But it was always about keeping Russia in, perhaps in one of the more outward circles, in a sense, because, of course, it could not be treated like other European countries, but keeping Russia in as part of the same order. I think what this war has done is woken us up to the terrible, because it's terrible, reality that a European security architecture, not out of European will, but out of Russian will, has to be built, I'm going to use a strong term, against Russia. Because with this Russia, this Russia represents a threat. Now, how does this then connect to the broader enlargement story, obviously including in the Western Balkans? I would put it in these terms. Enlargement, basically, especially after 2007, started dying away. And it started dying away because on both sides, both on the EU side and on the side of the Western Balkans, let alone Turkey, there was this, sort of dance in which, as many experts of the region would say, candidate countries would pretend to reform and the EU would pretend to enlarge. Now, underlying that pretense was the fact that non-enlargement was an option, in the sense that there could be an EU that was basically worried about itself. There would be countries outside, let's say in a buffer zone outside, in the Western Balkans, Turkey, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, that perhaps would not be fantastically democratic and prosperous and secure and all good things, but they would kind of be more or less stable. And I think this assumption, basically, it was unspoken, no one really said it, but basically it was there, it was present up until the war broke out. With the war breaking out and with this recognition that a European security architecture has to be built, unfortunately, against Russia, the enlargement question as a strategic imperative comes back to the agenda. And it basically comes back because there are no buffer states. You're either on one side of the line or on the other side of the line. And so enlargement becomes an imperative, of course, now being mainly driven by Ukraine. But on that Ukrainian train, not only is there Moldova, potentially Georgia, but the question of the Western Balkans comes back in. I mean, let's be very frank. Accession negotiations would have probably remained in the freezer with Albania and North Macedonia had it not been for the war in Ukraine. Candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina would have probably remained in the deep freeze had it not been for the war in Ukraine. Now, this does not mean that enlargement will happen. So I don't mean to say that it will necessarily happen, but simply that the enlargement dynamic is back. And so to me, the question really is, how is it that we can really, we believers in enlargement, and I guess, both of us belong to this category, how is it that we can really use this momentum, because it's not going to last forever?
I agree with you that there is this window of opportunity, but on the other hand, I haven't seen bold steps from the so-called non-recognizers within EU and NATO family towards Kosovo or statehood projects in our region. And this is somehow also putting European Union in a difficulty in mediating crisis after crisis in our region. So don't you think that now we might end up into a status quo situation even after 24th of February?
Yes, I mean, I think the risk is real. I mean, when I say there is an enlargement opportunity, well, opportunities can also be missed. I do think that at the moment, what really needs to be done is for the EU to internally start having also very honest conversation amongst itself concerning what are the reforms that need to happen. And maybe the answer is zero. What are the reforms that need to happen within the European Union so as to become ready for enlargement tomorrow morning? Let's say North Macedonia is ready tomorrow morning. Is the EU ready to take in one new member state tomorrow morning? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe there aren't, revolutionary things that need to happen, but I think what's really important is not to make this, not to fall back into this deepening versus widening sort of dilemma, and actually to recognize that the truth is that since we stopped widening, so basically since enlargement went to sleep, there hasn't been a lot of deepening either. So actually, unless you have the spur that comes from the necessity of enlargement, those reforms won't happen. So all this to say that I think alongside a more active European role in peacemaking in the Western Balkans, what also needs to happen now, alongside the accession policy, is also an honest conversations about reforms that the EU needs to have in order to really be ready for enlargement tomorrow.
Jean-Claude Juncker once was speaking about a political commission. Ursula von der Leyen is speaking about a geopolitical commission. Having into consideration the new reality in our continent, in a wider sense, What would be nowadays the compelling story of Europe, of European Union? A few years ago you wrote about a green and global Europe. And it seems to me, after I read your book, that most of the things were triggered because of Vladimir Putin. Most of the things you were also describing in your book. So what would be nowadays the compelling story, the compelling narrative?
So I still believe that that green story is fundamentally important. I think it's fundamentally important for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, it will happen, and it needs to happen. I mean, otherwise we're all going to fry, basically. Secondly, as the US is also teaching us, this is a growth story. I mean, this is a Europe that is and doesn't need to be associated with rules and restrictions and restraint, but it's about the productive and innovative potential of Europe. So, it's normative, it's economic, it's about reconnecting to the priorities of younger generations. So, in this respect, it's a political Europe. And of course, it's strategic for reasons that have to do indeed with the dependence on Russian gas, but not only. I mean, it is also about how do you avoid new dependencies on critical minerals vis-a-vis China? How does this green story interlock with that growing competition between the United States and China, and how does the EU basically position itself? What does it mean, going back to the conversation about our relationship with the global South? What does it mean? This green dimension is right at the heart of the tensions between the global North and South. Given basically that a lot of that resentment comes from precisely also the climate story and the fact that basically, we are responsible for sort of the lion's share of the problem, basically. So, I think that green story will remain a very dominant narrative. I increasingly think, and this connects also to to the geopolitical commission, I increasingly think that global peace will continue to be and will have to become even more dominant than what it has been. I think, developments from the pandemic to the war have demonstrated that, there isn't a drawbridge, basically, that Europe can lift and keep the rest of the world outside. And so I think that the crises that will come in the months and year ahead will continue to reaffirm the fact that the EU needs to increasingly have that global dimension. I actually think that we have gone back or forward, I don't know, depending on how you look at things, to a pre-Lisbon Treaty setup, de facto, not de jure. So you basically have a very strong European Commission that also increasingly plays that global role. Of course, you have the European Council, and the Council and member states continue to be important. But the hybrid institutions that were established with the Lisbon Treaty, the European External Action Service, and the double-hatted High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission, have not really delivered. They've not really delivered on the promise. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of them. I mean, institutions almost never die. Essentially, the European External Action Service acting increasingly like a Directorate General of the European Commission. So you go back, in a sense, to the old, Chris Patton, Javier Solana model of, external relations and with external relations enlargement as well, and foreign policy and security policy and defense in the more traditional, in a sense of the term. So this is simply a kind of institutional note as to how I think that global role is increasingly going to play out.
Green and global are two sides of the same coin, and you rightly pointed out that it's a political project, it's a normative, it's economic, it has to do with the mindset, with the way of life. You have written this European global strategy. And I remember at the time I was a bit complaining about the fact that Western Balkans was mentioned only within the security context of European Union or Europe. So my question today is what Europe can do more to engage neighbors or the ring of friends, in this case also Western Balkans, into this project. I mean, to prepare them, to support them into this green and global project.
I think there are two things that interlock with one another. I mean, the first is the conversation about how is it that the accession process and policy should change, and then obviously there is the conversation about how the EU itself changes. But as far as the former is concerned, this goes into discussions about, you know, should we be thinking about gradual sectoral forms of integration? And, you know, you see basically the Commission, you know, Ursula von der Leyen recently basically made the point about, you know, integrating candidate countries in the single market, you know, front loading some of the funds, thinking, you know, also in terms of cohesion funds. So this is all good, fine, but it's a little bit retro, the way in which it's talked about. Yes, single market and cohesion funds and all the rest of it. But how about this kind of, you know, big new thing, you know, or big new things? So what does it mean to integrate candidate countries in the European Green Deal? What does it mean to integrate candidate countries in the EU's digital market? What does it mean, you know, as, you know, I think that the next political institutional cycle, you know, starting after next year's European Parliament elections, will have to give an answer to what the EU's industrial policy is going to be. At the moment, we have, you know, yes, you know, Net Zero Industrial Act, Critical Materials Act, but to be honest, there's no money behind this. And at the moment, it's only ideas. And inevitably, it will have to wait until the next cycle to really put some, you know, flesh onto those bones. But in those conversations, what is the role of candidate countries? So I guess what I'm saying here is that as we think about gradual sectoral forms of integration in order to engage and include candidate countries before, let's not get stuck into the mental categories of the past, but really think about how is it that the EU already is changing now and include the candidate countries into that future project rather than simply into the past.
Speaking about opportunities, it seems to me that this year ahead we are going to have three important elections in US, UK and the elections for the European Parliament. What would be your suggestions? What the Euro-Atlantic family should do more?
Well, and you know, and these are all critical elections. I mean, I guess the easiest one is the UK, in the sense that what I mean by the easiest is that the one that really seems to present fewer risks. It seems to me that the season of Johnson-style populism, Brexit populism, is over. So in the quote-unquote worst of circumstances, you basically have conservatives as, you know, in their current, you know, genetic mutation, a la Sunak. In the more likely and positive scenario, you have a change of government, which doesn't necessarily mean that with a Labour government, the UK comes back into the European Union, but it certainly means that that relationship, perhaps through different sectoral agreements, will start deepening, and perhaps that will eventually represent a stepping stone back in. Then you have the US, and this is this is potentially, horror scenario. But even if it's not horror scenario, and of course by horror scenario I mean a Trump scenario, um, even if it is a Biden 2 scenario, I think it should give us reason to pause, reflect, and then accelerate some strands of work. I think Joe Biden will be the last Atlanticist president of the United States. So even if after Biden there's going to be another, as in after Biden and Biden, there's going to be another Democrat president, he or she will likely be more like Obama than like Biden. I think it's a generational question. And then come the European Parliament elections. There is one scenario that I worry about slightly less, and one that I worry more of. One that I worry less of, that you hear a lot of talk about this in Italy, is the scenario in which there's going to be a new majority in the European Parliament constituted by the EPP and the ECR, the group of conservatives. And of course, this is Giorgia Meloni's dream scenario, in which she's going to be, the queen maker of this new majority in the European Parliament. I actually think that that's not a very likely scenario. I mean, it would be terrible, but I don't think it's very likely. So I actually think there's going to still be a rather traditional majority in the European Parliament. But then comes what I do worry about. I think in that traditional majority in the European Parliament, that green component is going to become a lot weaker. And so the question becomes, how do we keep up the momentum in the energy transition if the Greens in the European Parliament are weaker? And as I said, given that I still do genuinely believe that this is and continues to be the narrative, I think there is a risk basically out there that one should try and see how to mitigate.
I asked you about opportunities because I know that you are an optimist and you are focused also on the risks, and I thank you for that. My very last question, what is the recent book in your bookshelves that you would like to share with us?
Well, I actually read, it's a new book, but I only read it recently, and I really recommend it, is Tim Snyder's Bloodlands. This is basically a book that reviews a history that many, certainly West Europeans, are not aware of, which is basically the history of the lands, the bloodlands between Hitler and Stalin. Sort of from the 1930s, through to the 1950s, 60s. And, I think that if we really want to understand what is happening in Ukraine now, that is really a must read. For those, hopefully not too many, that have not read it, it's definitely a must read for everyone, I think.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you on Public Square, Nathalie.
Thank you very much.